What is a historical event you can't believe happened? That time Emperor Napoleon escaped from the island he was imprisoned on after his army was finally defeated, snuck back into France under the nose of King Louis XVIII and literally every royal guard and roadblock from Marseille to Paris. Then when he was actually caught just outside of Paris, he managed to persuade the soldiers, who just so happened to be former Bonapartists, to escort him into Paris, where he managed to successfully cause the king to flee, on top of raising a full army to wage war against Europe again. The only time in history an emperor took back an entire country just by waving his hat. When the English monarchy was restored in 1660, King Charles II ordered the posthumous execution of the members of parliament involved in his dad's execution who had died during the interregnum. Basically, he wasn't going to let the fact that the guys were dead get in the way of vengeance. He literally had them dug up, hung the corpses, and then beheaded them. On May 1st, 1945, the day after Adolf Hitler committed suicide, General Hans Krebs was sent under a white flag to deliver a letter to General Vasily Chukov of the Red Army, containing surrender terms acceptable to Joseph Goebbels, then acting as Chancellor of Germany. Krebs had not announced that he was coming, taking Chukov by surprise. At that time, he was being interviewed by two war correspondents, Konstantin Simonov and Yevgeny Idolmatovsky, accompanied by musician Matt V. Blanter, who wrote the internationally famous Katasha. When he was informed that Krebs was waiting for him outside, Chukov, wanting to speak to Krebs as soon as possible, while making sure the meeting would seem official, quickly gave the interviewers, who were dressed in uniform, medals so that they would act as his staff. Not knowing what to do with Blanter, however, since he was dressed in civilian clothing, Chukov hastily shoved him into a cupboard and ordered him to keep quiet, which he managed to do for the duration of the meeting. Unfortunately, the meeting came to nothing, as the Soviets would accept nothing but unconditional surrender. Once the meeting is over, just as Krebs and his men are leaving with the bad news, Blanter passes out from lack of oxygen and falls out of the cupboard onto the floor of the room right in front of them. There was a scene in the film Downfall showing the events of this meeting, but the scene was removed out of worry that it would not be taken seriously, even though it really happened. The story about that guy who got forgotten in a Russian prison for decades, and since none of the guards spoke Hungarian, they just thought it was ramblings from an insane person. Eventually someone realized the mistake, and he was freed. I still think the Fourth Crusade is the most absurd historic event ever. Basically the Pope declares another crusade to try to reclaim Jerusalem. Somehow, the Crusaders end up in Constantinople a year later and absolutely ravage that city and massacre the population. I've read a ton about all the political intrigue and f-ups that went into it, but I'll give the gist of it. Two ragtag groups of crusaders show up to conquer Jerusalem. Ragtag because most of Europe was at war with each other at the time and didn't have many troops or money to spare. One group decides to make their way to Egypt, where the invasion of Jerusalem was to start from, by paying their way privately on whatever merchant vessels they could find. The other poorer group was going to catch a ride on the Venetian fleet that their lords were supposed to pay for. Except when they got to Venice they didn't have enough money, so the crafty Venetians decided that they would waive the fee in exchange for pillaging an unruly city north of Greece, Zara, that wasn't paying their taxes. The Crusaders agree and proceed to murder and rape a bunch of Orthodox Christians under the banner of the Catholic Church. The Crusaders then spend the winter in this area north of Greece, and while they are wintering there, somehow a deposed ruler of Byzantium hears about their misadventures and shows up with a plan that the Crusaders will help him retake the throne of Byzantium in exchange for a bunch of treasure from the royal coffers once he is back in power. It's also worth mentioning that at this point, the Pope had heard of the sacking of Zara and had written an angry letter recalling this group of crusaders and also excommunicating every single one of them, because what the fuck. The Crusader leaders decide to burn the Pope's letter and listen to the Byzantine instead, so off they go in the Venetian ships to Constantinople. As soon as winter is over, the Crusaders arrive at Constantinople and after a brief siege occupy the city. Their job done, they make camp outside the city and wait for their Byzantine benefactor to pay them using his newly reclaimed kingdom. Except the Formerly deposed Byzantine has come to find that the royal coffers are completely empty because Byzantium is effed and poor and he can't pay the Crusaders anything. He tries to stall them as long as he can, but the Crusaders are not a happy bunch. They have been dragged around the Mediterranean, receiving no crusading glory, no money, and very little food. So they besiege the city again. And this time, they are not nice about it. Already in tatters from the earlier siege and the whole being poor bit, the city is absolutely destroyed. The historic accounts of this event are horrific. The Crusaders murdered rich and poor alike in the streets. They raped nuns. They sat a whore on the seat of the Hagia Sophia, the most holy place in the Orthodox Church. They stole everything that wasn't nailed down, melted holy gold icons, and plundered all the art they could carry. The plundering goes on for a while, days or a week maybe. The Pope writes another letter absolutely outraged, again recalling the Crusaders and excommunicating them again, because what the fuck. This time the Crusade leaders relent, and they leave Constantinople a burning ruin and return to Rome. They present the Pope with some of the treasure they stole from Constantinople, and he decides to lift the excommunication of every crusader that participated. Meanwhile, the second crusader group who made their own way to Egypt has been sitting there for about a year wondering where the F everyone else is. Thus concludes the Fourth Crusade, an event which ruined relations between the Catholic and Orthodox Church for basically ever, and which fatally wounded the already failing kingdom of Byzantium, which would be taken by the Ottomans a short time later. The Crusaders never even made it to the Middle East. There were still Japanese soldiers well into the 1970s who had no idea the World War II was over. Like, they just got left behind by the Navy and held out on isolated islands for decades. One guy in particular spent his time feuding with the Filipino police. Everyone tried to tell him the war was over, but he thought it was a bunch of propaganda. Word eventually got back to Japan, where they had to look up his commanding officer, who had since left the military for a career as a businessman, and fly him to the Philippines. Only after receiving a direct order from his commanding officer did the guy stand down. The Black Death. It's unbelievable how a disease ended up killing somewhere between 30% and 60% of Europe's population. It must have been hell for the people who lived at that time. The 335 years war between the Isles of Scilly and the Netherlands started in 1651 and ended in 1986 when a historian was trying to debunk the myth that the two were at war. He discovered that the two were in fact at war and didn't know it. This prompted the signing of a peace treaty to end the longest war, to have zero battles and no bloodshed. The Dutch more or less declared war and forgot about it. The Dutch ambassador joked that it must have been harrowing for the Sicilians to know we could have attacked at any moment. Russia almost launched nuclear missiles at the US over false alarms. However, one Russian soldier, Stanislav Petrov, decided the reports of a US nuclear attack were a computer error. He prevented World War III from accidentally happening. The famines in China in 1958 and 1961 where tens of millions of people starved to death. Imagine, in your parents' generation, if millions of people died of starvation, and no one talks about it. The dancing plague, otherwise known as Sankt Vitus dance. It happened during medieval times, and it involved spontaneous and continuous dancing by crowds of people until they collapsed of exhaustion or died. Link for further reading in the doobly-doo. When your boy Caesar was kidnapped by pirates and he laughed at them for low ransom and told them to raise it. Then over the course of time it took the Romans to raise the money. Caesar developed something of a friendship with the pirates to the point where he was joining in with their games and exercises. Robot editor note: Caesar told them that when the ransom is paid, he'll come back and hang them all. The pirates thought that he was joking. When the ransom arrived, he handed it over to the pirates and was set free. With his freedom he returned to the pirate ship, which was still where he left it, took them as prisoners, and then crucified them. The first submarine was made and used in war in 1776. A lone Viking held an entire army for almost an hour and killed over 40 men. A dentist killed over 100 Japanese soldiers by himself in World War II. The USA nearly nuked North Carolina with 2 multiple megaton warheads. How did the US win the Revolutionary War? I've learned about the war in class literally every year in my entire grade school career. Every time we learn about it, the teacher always glosses over the war itself, and it makes it sound like we were pretty much losing the whole time. I just can't fathom how a bunch of militia were able to overtake land from one of the greatest military forces at the time. That's it for today. I've compiled a gigantic list with some of the topics in this thread. If you want to learn more about something, like, comment and subscribe, and I'll see you all tomorrow.